This beautiful flowering rose bush is a familiar sight to almost everyone. Many of us recognize this magnificent oak tree and this delicate fern. But what is it about these plants that helps us recognize them? Though we may not realize it, we've all learned to distinguish certain features when we look at plants. For example, we recognize this as a rose bush because of its showy flowers, its divided leaves, and its prickly stems. This oak tree has familiar lobed leaves and smooth bark to help us identify it. And the delicate feather-like fronds of this fern set it apart from most other plants. Being able to recognize plants and remember their names is an important part of most agricultural careers. By becoming familiar with a large number of plants and their names, you can communicate effectively with customers and employers, and you'll gain an appreciation for the many different plants around you. Initially, many plants may look very similar, and the task of learning to tell them apart may seem overwhelming. But with practice and by knowing what to look for, you'll find that plant identification is an enjoyable and rewarding skill that anyone can learn. In this video, we'll explore some important ways to study and identify the plants around you. Though there are several different features you'll learn to study when identifying plants, the best place to begin is with the leaves. Also known as the plant's foliage, leaves are very often the most distinctive and easily recognized part of a plant. One of the first things you'll notice about leaves is their color. Plant foliage can be found in varying shades of green, from a deep green to an almost yellowish green. Some leaves have more than one color. These we call variegated leaves. These coleus and spider plants are examples of plants with variegated foliage. Still other plants may have gray, purple, or red leaves. It's very important to look at the youngest as well as the oldest leaves of a plant because their colors may vary with age. Here we see the younger leaves of this photinia are reddish, while the older leaves are green. Along with color, leaf texture will help you recognize plants. Some leaves are soft and fuzzy, as are these of this African violet, while other leaves may feel rough, waxy, or spongy. The thickened leaves of this succulent feel very fleshy. Another reason to touch plants is to release any distinguishing fragrance. This sage and this rosemary are both strongly scented. Also, some foliage exudes an identifying sap if the tissue is damaged. The next leaf characteristic you might notice is shape. The flat part of a leaf, known as the leaf blade, can occur in many forms. This willow tree has leaves with long, narrow, pointed blades, compared to these of a peperomia, which are nearly round. Also notice that the base of this leaf is heart-shaped, while this one is nearly straight. The outline of the edge of the leaf blade is called the leaf margin. This hydrangea leaf has many small teeth along its margin. The leaf blade of this tropical philodendron is lobed or deeply indented. And the blade of this ficus leaf has a smooth margin. Sometimes it's necessary to look very closely at the leaf margin to notice subtle characteristics. But you'll find that such careful examination of the leaf will be very useful in identifying the plant the next time you see it. All leaves have veins that carry water, nutrients, and carbohydrates throughout the plant. Most leaves have one main vein in the center, with less noticeable veins branching from it. Other leaves, such as this begonia leaf, have several major veins originating from the same area. Still other leaves have nearly parallel veins. Up to this point, we've been looking at simple leaves. That is, leaves that are whole with only one section. But some plants have compound leaves. That is, leaves that are made up of individual sections called leaflets. This umbrella tree leaf has 9 leaflets arranged like a fan or the palm of a hand. The leaf blade of most plants is attached to the stem by a petiole, which is also part of the leaf. Just as with leaves, petioles come in different colors and textures. The petiole of this apricot leaf is pink. The petiole of this Chinese evergreen is variegated, as are the leaves. Another characteristic of leaves is their arrangement. Opposite leaves grow directly across from each other on opposite sides of the stem, as with this maple. Alternate leaves are staggered along the stem, as with this weeping fig. Whorled leaves are so called when 3 or more leaves originate from the same area on the stem. Finally, basal leaves seem to come up directly from the ground because its stem is actually at the soil level. Some plants, such as pines, junipers, and cypress, have very unique leaves. The long, slender leaves of this pine tree are called needles. Different pines can be identified by the length and color of their needles, as well as by the number of needles in a cluster. This mugo pine has soft, relatively short green needles in clusters of 2. This big cone pine has long, stiff, gray-green needles in clusters of 3. Junipers and cypress have leaves that are called scales, which lie close to the stem of the plant. Such plants can be identified by the color, shape, size, and sometimes the fragrance of their scales. We've just gone over several characteristics of leaves and have introduced a number of terms that may be new to you. But with some practice, these important leaf characteristics will become easier and easier to recognize. And they'll help you notice identifying qualities of plants as you study them. Next, let's look at the stems and branches of plants. Herbaceous plants develop soft new stems each year, and these stems stay soft throughout the life of the plant. Herbaceous stems are usually green, but they're found in other colors as well. As with leaves, stems may be smooth, rough, or hairy. Notice the soft hairs along the stem of this purple passion vine. Woody plants, such as trees and shrubs, have a protective covering on their branches and older stems that we call bark. Often bark has an interesting, colorful texture. This white birch and this redwood tree both have easily recognized bark. Some other types of plants that you might encounter are grasses, succulents and cacti, and aquatic plants. Throughout history, plants have been grown for the beauty and usefulness of their flowers and fruit. Though we can't depend on fruit and flowers for year-round identification purposes, these plant parts should be carefully studied. Let's look at some flower characteristics first. Flowers may be large and showy, as are these magnolia blossoms, or they may be very small and hardly noticeable. Flowers are found in many interesting forms. Notice the trumpet-shaped flowers of this brugmansia and the unusual shape of this anthurium. Regular flowers are symmetrical. That is, they can be divided along a straight line into two identical halves that are mirror images of each other. Irregular flowers are not symmetrical, and the two halves created by a line are not mirror images of each other. The colorful parts of a flower are usually the petals, and they can be found in every color of the rainbow. Some petals may be streaked or spotted with different colors. A flower may have many petals, as does this begonia, or no petals at all. The sepals of a flower protect the developing bud. The sepals may be plain and green, or they may be as showy and colorful as the petals. In fact, the sepals of some flowers are actually the showiest part of the flower. You will also want to examine the center of the flower and take notice of the pistils and stamens. The pistil is the receptive female structure containing the ovary. It is usually in the very center of the flower. The stamens are the male structures which carry pollen. In some flowers, the stamens are the showiest part of the flower. Notice the numerous red stamens of these bottlebrush flowers. This beautiful hydrangea cluster looks like one large flower, when in fact it is made up of numerous individual flowers called florets. When many florets make up a cluster, the cluster is called an inflorescence. These foxglove spikes are another type of inflorescence, as is this chrysanthemum. We're all familiar with the sweet fragrances of rose, jasmine, and honeysuckle. You'll find that a flower's fragrance will be of great help in remembering a plant. A fruit is the matured ovary of a flower, and it usually contains one to several seeds. This community garden is filled with fruits of all kinds. As with other parts of plants, fruits come in many different shapes, colors, and textures. Most of us are quite familiar with fleshy fruits, such as plums, oranges, and these colorful firethorn berries. But not all fruits are fleshy. Many are dry, as is this capsule from a poppy flower. This maple has a dry winged fruit that can be carried by the wind. Most nuts, such as walnuts and pecans, are another example of dry fruits. Once you've become familiar with the specific characteristics of a plant, such as its leaves, stems, bark, flowers, and fruit, it's a good idea to step back and get an overall impression of the shape of the plant form as it grows. Many plants are upright growers. That is, they become taller and wider with age. Many of the trees in the background have just such a form. This poplar tree has a very columnar shape, and this hydrangea plant forms a large symmetrical mound. Other plants are prostrate growers. They stay low and seem to hug the ground. Most ground covers are prostrate growers. Vining growers are plants that have twining stems or special structures called tendrils that enable them to use other plants or objects for support. These plants may form shrubby mounds, ground covers, or they may take on the shape of whatever they're using for support. You may have noticed that we've been looking at plants during the peak of their growing season. with many of them in full bloom. Although this may be the ideal time to study plants when most of their identifying characteristics are evident, we also need to be confident in identifying plants during other times of the year as well. Winter is the most challenging season for plant identification because many woody plants drop their leaves as the temperatures get cooler in the fall. We call such plants deciduous plants. Let's look at some techniques for studying deciduous plants when their branches are leafless during their dormant period. In some cases, we can identify a plant by its silhouette or outline. An elm, in this case an American elm, has a very different silhouette than a maple. This one is a sugar maple. If we're lucky, some fallen leaves may be found on the ground around the plant. Although these leaves will not be in ideal condition, we can still use them to notice shape and margin characteristics. We also want to look for any fruit that may be on the ground around the plant or still hanging on the leafless branches. These ball-shaped seed clusters from the sycamore tree are very distinguishing. With plants that don't provide us with such clues, we need to look more closely at the branches themselves. As we've noticed before, many woody plants have very distinctive bark, even in the middle of winter. We recognize this tree as a white birch. Though this maple tree is leafless, we can still study its leaf arrangement. Leaf scars are small roughened areas on the stem just below the buds. Leaf scars show us where the leaves were attached before the plant shed them. Notice this opposite arrangement. Dormant buds are structures that will develop in the spring into leaves, branches, and flowers. Noticing the shape and color of these dormant buds will help us identify the plant. Some dormant buds may be rounded or flattened, while others may be pointed. Notice the reddish color of these Japanese maple buds. Usually, a combination of the characteristics we've discussed are most helpful in identifying deciduous plants during the winter months. Armeria maritima, sea thrift. Festuca ovina variety glauca, blue fescue. Identifying these plants is easy. They all have plant tags. But learning to identify plants without the tags by their physical characteristics is a necessary tool for students and professionals involved with plants. You also must learn to match the plants you study with their correct botanic and common name. By doing so, you can communicate precisely and effectively. At this time, you're probably familiar with the common names of plants. Here we see trailing rosemary. Common names are unscientific names used by most home gardeners and the general public. We've used many common names in this discussion, such as rose, honeysuckle, African violet, and redwood tree. Though common names are usually easier to remember, they can cause confusion. For example, this familiar garden pansy has over 50 common names, depending on the geographical area in which it's grown. This popular houseplant is commonly referred to as creeping Charlie, mint Charlie, or Swedish ivy. Because of the variability of common names, we must also learn to identify plants by their botanic names. Botanic names are Latin names. This plant chamomile has a botanic name of Anthemus nobilis. In general, a plant will have only one correct botanic name. This allows plant scientists, or anyone involved with plants, anywhere in the world, to communicate with respect to that plant and know that they are referring to the exact same plant. So chamomile is known as Anthemus nobilis everywhere in the world. The first word of a botanic name is the plant's genus, which is a grouping of closely related plants. A genus may contain many plants or only one. The first letter of the genus should always be capitalized. The second word of a botanic name is technically called the specific epithet. Usually we call it the species name. This name tells us exactly which plant we're referring to within a genus. For example, both this plant and this plant are in the genus Ficus, but this one is called Ficus benjamina, and this one is called Ficus lyrata. The species name should not in general be capitalized. When writing a botanic name, both the genus and species should be underlined or italicized. Some plants will have another name following the genus and species. It may be a subspecies name or the name of a particular horticultural variety of the plant. This popular ficus is called Ficus benjamina golden princess. Learning to match plants with their common and botanic names is another area of plant identification that becomes easier with practice. Some botanic names are quite descriptive. For example, the botanic name for this juniper is Juniperus horizontalis, and it certainly does have a horizontal growing habit. Other botanic names may be more difficult to associate with the plants they're naming, so many people develop memory tricks for remembering plant names. Let's look at an example. The botanic name for carnation is Dianthus caryophyllus. Now this is going to sound silly to you, but the way I remember the name of this plant is by creating an image in my mind. I think of a woman named Diane carrying Phyllis through a field of carnations. Dianthus caryophyllus. Memory tricks like this one may seem silly to you at first, but they can make learning plants and their names easier and more creative. One of the very best ways to study botanic and common names is to make a flashcard for each plant. Write the botanic name on one side of an index card and the common name on the other. Go over them at least once every day, or have a friend use them to quiz you. The spellings and pronunciations of botanic names may be quite difficult at first, and some can be quite challenging. The best way to approach the spelling of a botanic name is to practice writing it several times until you can write it without any difficulty. You'll find that with time, even the more difficult words are easy to spell. Listening to your instructor pronounce botanic names is the best way to become familiar with the sound of Latin words. Sound them out slowly to yourself until the pronunciation feels comfortable. Also, there are several botanic dictionaries available that include information on Latin pronunciation. You can also press plant samples at home to use for study. Place the plant samples between newspaper in a plant press or under a stack of books. Once they're flat and somewhat dry, usually within a day or two, they can be glued or taped to a piece of paper or to your flashcard for labeling. If placed under clear contact paper, which can be found at drugstores and hardware stores, plant samples will last for quite some time. You have been exposed to many plants during this introduction to plant identification. Let's review 10 of them and match them with their botanic and common names. Magnolia grandiflora, southern magnolia. Notice the species name, which means large-flowered magnolia. Sequoia sempervirens, coast redwood. Acer saccharum, sugar maple. Philodendron celoum, tree philodendron. Quercus lobata, valley oak. Notice that the species name lobata describes the margins of the leaves. Begonia tuber hybrida, begonia. Acer palmatum, Japanese maple. Salix babylonica, weeping willow. Ulmus americana, American elm. Hydrangea macrophylla, hydrangea. The skill of plant identification is one of the most important abilities you'll develop. With practice and experience, you'll find that the recognition of plants and their names is a satisfying and useful tool. And perhaps most important, learning to recognize plants will enhance your appreciation of the many different and wonderful plants in the world around us.